This is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello everybody, it is Thursday, August the 24th, 2023. Regular viewers of the show know we've been trying to, so to speak, remember the future. We've been going back and thinking about the origins of social media and blogging in order to figure out what to do about social media, given Elon Musk and X and Zuckerberg and Threads and all the other hysteria and drama around contemporary social media. A couple of weeks ago, we had the great blogger and technologist Dave Weiner on the show, the father in many people's views of blogging itself, and the author of Scripting News, one of the oldest continuous blogs. And then a couple of days ago, we had Ethan Zuckerman, another longtime pundit, technologist, observer, writer on the show, remembering the digital future. Another guy who's been around a long time is my guest today on the show, Scott Rosenberg, longtime journalist, thinker, activist. He was even there right at the beginning with the whole Earth electronic link. And Scott is joining us, looking very youthful, given how aged he is in terms of digital history, from my old haunt in Berkeley. Scott, do you feel ancient these days?
Well, to a degree, yes. I realized in thinking about this interview that I built my first website just almost 30 years ago now. So when you think 30 years of doing, HTML websites, I'm an online journalist now. I'm still doing that. 30 years is a long time.
It is a long time in anyone's lifetime. As I said, you were around during this thing that we call the world, the whole Earth electronic link. Do you see that, and it was established in 1985, do you see that as the first real social media site?
I don't think you can ever sort of nail down that kind of first. The well was certainly, maybe the first time that using network computers to communicate and form a community was something that emerged as an option, or seemed like a possibility for people outside of smaller subcultures of computer programmers or people who hung out on bulletin boards. But there were bulletin boards before the well, and before that there were systems like the Plato system, and people had their own bulletin boards on university computer systems, and of course there was Usenet. It's I think a little bit of a fool's game to get into the whole question of first. It's sort of, think of it more as this sort of all these different threads that gradually get intertwined and form a bigger thing.
What was, or what is, Scott, a bulletin board?
Well, a bulletin board was, if you go back to the 80s and you think of people just beginning to put PCs on their desks, and if you were, you had a PC or later a Mac, and you had a modem, which was literally a device before they were a part of the computer. They were actually these things where you would put the headset of your phone into an acoustic coupler, and it would make noise, the same noise that people later associated with modems, that high-pitched kind of whine. You would have your computer, your personal computer, dial up to dial a number, connect to what was essentially another person's PC that was running a program that would let you post messages, read other people's messages, thus the term bulletin board.
I know you're not keen on firsts, but Do you remember the first time you heard the term social media, or was that just something that everyone talked about instinctively when they talked about the internet?
The term social media is actually kind of a late comer. If I could be wrong, but I don't
You're
think
never wrong, Scott.
it it didn't really come. It certainly didn't come into wide use until the mid 2000s, I would say. Before that, the framing, the term, the metaphor was much more about online community and virtual community. That was the title of the book Howard Rheingold wrote, largely based on his experiences on the well, but also addressing a lot of its predecessors. That book came out in like 1995. I don't think, if you looked in the index to that book, for instance, I don't think you'd find the word social media.
I actually want to get Howard on the show. Before we went live, we talked about how easy he is to track down. He's over in Marin, I hope. What was the well like, Scott? You were involved. Was there something distinctive, or was it really no different from Twitter or Facebook or any of these other social media platforms?
Well, it was distinctive. I think and there's been great work on the well. There's Katie Hafner's book, and there's which is a chronicle of it. There's books like Fred Turner's book about the counterculture and the internet. I think the well was a project that came out of the sort of communitarian world of the 70s, and then it started as a project that involved the Whole Earth people, Stuart Brand, and the sort of connection between that world and the more sort of entrepreneurial and libertarian side of that culture kind of evolved in the direction of, and all of that kind of came together in 1986 when they started the well. And then the other key ingredient was the Grateful Dead, because in the earliest days of the well, which was a costly thing to get on at the beginning, you actually paid by the hour, every hour that you were connected. The people who kept it going were Grateful Dead fans who used it as because they were itinerants. They were people who were following the band as it toured, and they lived in lots of different places. And I guess many of them were PC enthusiasts, so they already had the equipment to dial into the well and use it as their bulletin board. So all of these things sort of played into the unique character of the well. And the other factor that fed into it was that media people picked up on it fairly quickly, because reporters are always looking for stories, and journalists haven't always up until that point had a way to sort of network across newsrooms. Newsrooms were very isolated, siloed, and suddenly the well came along. There was this media conference, and journalists were sort of hobnobbing in a way that now we take for granted. Twitter has became the place for doing that over the last 10, 15 years. But in the late 80s, early 90s, this was mind-blowing. It was not something that had really happened before historically. So those were some of the things that made the well really significant. The other thing was that it was a weird and wonderful combination of sort of public discourse, people arguing about politics and culture and matters of the public sphere, and a social community where people were making friends and were sharing their personal kinds of trials and triumphs and that sort of thing. And all of those threads were later, I think, would later resurface in some similar ways and some different ways in the movement that came to be known as blogging.
I want to get on to blogging later. You wrote Say Everything, which is probably the most authoritative book on the history of blogging. But you mentioned this crossover between journalism and tech. We've had John Markov on the show a couple of times. I know you know him very well. New York Times, longtime New York Times technology writer, has just written a very interesting book about Stuart Brand. Was Brand the spirit of the well in his weird combination of abrasiveness, thin-skinnedness, if there's such a word, and on the other hand, this open, generous communitarianism? And maybe I'm being unfair or maybe too fair to Brand.
Yeah, I don't actually. I mean, I only joined the well in I think it was around 1990, and by then Stuart Brand was no longer even involved. So I wasn't around at the time that he was involved, and honestly, I don't know him well, and I can't really, I don't think most of the people who made the well their home were terribly aware of him personally or his influence. I think it was more that, what I know about his history now, obviously, is that he goes back to Ken Kesey and the 60s, and of course he's still around now. So he's and still writing, still a public figure. So he has this kind of long-term presence. But I think the well very quickly became, as and again, so many of the stories of social media were previewed in things that happened on the well, which is why it's still such an interesting story. One of the things that happened was that the community takes over to the extent that it is able and that it can. The people who joined pulled it in lots of different directions, whether it was the deadheads doing their thing, the media people doing their thing. There was a very active Gen X conference. There was a Women on the Well conference, which was just for women, and there were people who thought that was a really wonderful thing, and there were people who were unhappy that they were excluded, and that there was if you think about that happening in the early, in the late 80s and early 90s, and then you think ahead to the kinds of wars, gender wars that took over so much of social media in later years, you can see that. I also think you asked about Stuart Brand's character, and I think that the sort of abrasiveness and openness, I think that combination, on the one hand, openness of like it, in an online community, to varying degrees and in various ways, the door is generally open, right? You have a space that lots of different people enter and interact. And the abrasiveness has seemed to be a trait of, online communication, again, from the very beginning. Bulletin boards were famous for people fighting with each other. Usenet had, and the early internet was full of flame wars. That's where the term flaming originated. And all the way from that, direct line to the world of Twitter as it became, and now the world of sort of multiple social media platforms with the intense polarization.
Are you saying, Scott, that we can see the emergence of a type? Maybe not Stuart Brand. I don't want to personalize this too much.
Yeah.
But a type of person who was both simultaneously very thin-skinned, very easy to offend, also somewhat offensive, and that this living in public, which the well in some ways pioneered, created a new type of person?
So I think there's a chicken and egg question there, which has been endlessly debated and never resolved, which is the medium and the form and the structure of online communication somehow either does it create this sort of personality that you're describing, or does that somehow pre-exist, and is it just manifesting itself in this medium in ways that it couldn't before? I don't think anyone has sort of definitively answered that. My personal view is that there are dynamics of online communication that make it easier for this personality type to dominate. And that certainly in the early days, in the earliest days, whether we're talking Usenet or the Well, or even the early web, and perhaps some of the early days of blogging, you did not have you had an idealistic belief in the power of the individual, the importance of free expression, a sort of libertarian ideal that many held of free speech as the ultimate kind of good, and all of that was sort of weighing the scale way down on one side, and the other half of the scale, which has begun to receive more attention and more weight certainly over the last decade, is what happens in a group when you let some individuals shout others down. What happens in a group when you are sort of allowing the loudest voices to dominate, or you're creating incentives for people to fight? All of those questions that we've sort of explored endlessly in the age of Facebook and Twitter.
I'm talking with Scott Rosenberg, the author of Say Everything, the definitive history of blogging. We're going to come back and talk specifically about blogging in a second. I just want to remind everyone that this show, Keen On, is partially brought to you by Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Excellent new publication. Scott will get an annual free subscription for dedicating his time to Keen On. And I hope many of you will go to libertiesjournal.com to have a look at what it has to offer. I'm going to run a short video on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Scott Rosenberg talking about blogging. We'll be back in a second.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
As I said, you can find Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are back with Scott Rosenberg, the author of Say Everything, a wonderful book, a classic in its own way, about blogging, how blogging began, what it's becoming, and why it matters. It was written almost 20 years ago now. Scott, how did it begin? How do we trace the origins of blogging? And give me some years here.
Yeah, I started the story in 1994 or 5, which was the moment that the web, which had been around for several years already, but the moment that it really came to public consciousness. People like me sort of learned about it in 1994 and said, wow, there's this network that anybody can sort of create their own online homepage with. And it was a kind of, it was a separate, not controlled by entities like America Online, Prodigy, CompuServe, which were sort of the big tech of their day. And it was this sort of new space that seemed to invite creativity, individuality, and self-expression. So I started Say Everything with the story of Justin Hall, who was maybe, the most successful and best known exemplar of the very first wave of people who built websites in the era of when Netscape was starting and the web was just beginning to become popular. Justin was at that time a college student. He created this site called links.net where he posted lots of links to other websites, which was something that one did in the era before search engines, because that was how you would find other websites. And he also kept an online diary, which was basically an account of his life. It was extremely self-exposure oriented. It was what, a decade or so later, we would start to call oversharing. And it's in that way.
What did he overshare, Scott?
Oh, well, he would tell, he was 19, 20 years old. He would share the stories of his sexual life. He would, a few years later, he would begin posting photos. He was a believer in self-exposure as a social good, and I think in that regard, a lot of the initial as blogging took off, it didn't acquire that name blogging for until 1999. So
who came up with the word?
It was a guy named Peter Merholtz, who at the time was a web designer. He had his own weblog. So the term blog is a short form of weblog. Weblog was what these sites, which involved short posts that people would just put on their own websites in this reverse chronological order. Weblog was a name that another participant in that scene named Jorn Barger came up with, and he decided to call it a weblog. Like, you keep a log, you put it on the web. Made sense. And Peter, as a joke, one day posted on his weblog, I think I'm going to pronounce weblog weblog, and I'm going to shorten it to blog. And it was a joke. It was a parenthetical aside. And this is a relatively small scene at the time. People know each other.
This was 99.
Right. People are reading one another's weblogs, and it was kind of a gross term in a way. It was like, it doesn't sound very appealing. Blog. It's if you ran it through a sentiment analysis, you would find probably that it's not. It doesn't conjure,
it's not a diary. It doesn't
beauty.
Speak in that sense.
But people embraced it sort of as a joke, and before you knew it, then this company called Blogger started up, and which became
Ev Williams's company.
So Evan Williams and Meg Horahan started it out of it actually was a sort of side project from another company that they had.
Kind of like Twitter in a way. Exactly.
And that became sort of the first big blogging platform or provider. And I think its success sort of sealed that term's, centrality.
Would it be fair to say, Scott, that the whole point of blogging was that you didn't need programming skills to publish essays and photographs and even video online? That's what distinguished it from building a website in the old days, in the early to mid 90s.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I would put it within a larger context that the entire history of sort of expressing human expression on the web has been this sort of sequence of steps. At every phase, someone is coming along and saying, now you don't need to be a programmer. And so if you go back to the very beginning, the web itself was sort of like this thing saying, you no longer need to know Unix commands. all you need to do is learn this thing called HTML, which was really easy. It was just like putting little bracket codes around your text, so that someone like me, basically a writer, not a programmer, learning HTML in 1994 was really easy. There were like 15 things you needed to learn and you were done. It's gotten much more complicated since then. And so putting up a website, when I wrote my first website in 1994, was actually really easy, and you didn't need to be a programmer. But it became more and more complicated, and within several years, people felt like, creating a website, that's beyond me. And the blogging tools blogs emerged first. They were largely the original bloggers. Most of them were themselves programmers. People like Dave Weiner, who you had on this show, and many of the other early bloggers were programmers who basically had to invent tools as they went along for making it easy to create these websites that let you just post things in reverse chronological order. Having built these tools for themselves, they then said, okay, I want to make this available to people, many more people who aren't programmers. That was the impulse behind Blogger. It later became the impulse behind WordPress, which actually, became sort of the dominant platform for blogs and continues to be that to this day. And so there was always this sort of idea that it would be easy for non-programmers to do it. Ironically, over time, blogs, as they became more popular and people tried to do more things with them and make money with them and use them to create online publications and all of these things that this simple form got put to use for, suddenly blogging became complicated. And again, then you had something like Twitter came along and said, no, you don't need to have your own site. You don't need to have a domain. You don't need to have a blog. Just all you need is an account on this service and type 140 characters, and you have expressed yourself on the internet.
Scott, let's go back to our old friend, the chicken and the egg. You mentioned Dave Weiner, very talented programmer, one of the pioneers of blogging. Also, I think, and I don't think he would disagree, a very strongly opinionated libertarian thinker. Is there a connection between the say everything technology, or the technology that guys like Weiner developed that allowed everyone to say everything, and the kind of things that were being said by the early bloggers and then by the pioneers of Twitter and Facebook, of saying everything, of not keeping anything in reserve?
Well, I think there's a few dimensions to this. The first dimension is that, yes, there's no question to me that the original impulse in blogging is very individualistic, right? You say, this is my blog. This is, my voice, and I'm going to write about whatever I want to write about, whether it's a journalist doing reporting, whether it's a person keeping a diary, whether it's a student just sort of complaining about schoolwork, whether it's someone creating a fictional world. There's endless, it's a blank slate. So you do what you want with it. And the principle in the earliest days was that because these were one-person operations, there was no editor, right? There was no editor filtering what you were saying. There was, that was kind of you could have an editor for a blog, and over the years, many blogs did. But the original sort of ideological impulse was very much to say, no more editors, no more gatekeepers. This is my voice. Now, almost immediately, as these things happen in the online world, there's a sort of countervailing force, and that force in the blogging world was sort of pushback or feedback from two different directions. One is the community of other bloggers, because this was a scene and ultimately became many, many different scenes that were loosely connected, or in some cases not connected at all. But most blogs took, evolved in relation to other blogs, particularly in the form of just inspiration, right? Most people who started blogs in the early days were people who saw something that someone else was doing and said, I really like that. I want to do that myself. So there's that kind of inspiration. And then suddenly you're a part of a small scene. You're doing things, other people are doing things. There's cross-linking. There's people praising one another. There's people criticizing one another. So that's a part of the sort of feedback loop. And then the other feedback loop that came in somewhat later and more controversially was comments. The comments on blogs where people readers are talking back to the individual who is expressing him or herself on the blog. So then suddenly you're going from this is my space and my world to all these other voices coming in. In the classic blog format, the blogger is still ultimately in control because the blogger can delete the comment if it's, that's what the bloggers want to do. But the comments and the sort of drama and the conflicts that tended to happen in comment spaces on blogs, I think presaged the later world of social media. You had very much the same dynamics. You had situations where people were, what we would now today say, they were canceled, or people who.
We just did a show on canceled earlier today. Scott, finally, there's so much to talk about here, and I know you need to run. Looking back now, you've been around right from the beginning, from the Well days onwards. Now you're a very senior editor at Axios. You were the co-founder of Salon. So you know your way around both user-generated content media and more traditional mainstream media. How much, as we grapple with all the consequences of Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and so on and so forth in 2023, how useful is it, do you think, to go back to the origins, to go back to the days of the Well or Dave Weiner and WordPress and Blogger? Is it helpful? And what can or should we learn from those days if we're to get social media a little bit better in the age of X and TikTok and Threads?
Yeah, I think you're sort of preaching to the choir here in that I am, partly a historian and think that one of the tragedies of the tech industry is that it too often ignores its own past and does not learn lessons that it should learn. So I think there's always incredible value in going back and looking over these stories. To me, there's two really valuable lessons today. One more positive and one more negative. The positive thing that we can learn by looking back at the early days of blogging and early days of the web is just how central and important the value of people's desire to be heard is, separate and apart from the economic incentives and the economies of, blogging eventually became sort of like you too can quit your job and make a fortune as a blogger or something. There, everything in the online world ultimately becomes a sort of a hustle like that. But that isn't what blogging really was about, and it's certainly not why it's interesting to look back at it. The impulse for self-expression is real, and people's desire to connect in some authentic way, however difficult or even impossible it may feel today, given what so much of online spaces have become. I think that's still central, and it can't be ignored. The more negative lesson is just that one that I think the social media founders never really understood, and they could have learned if they had gone back and understood more about the early days of blogging, is about exclusion. The bloggers always felt that the scene they built and the world they created was one that was open to everyone. And that was true theoretically, in that if you could always start a blog, but the world, the culture that they created was heavily male, heavily white, heavily organized around programmers and what they were interested in, because they were the people who were doing it. And while many of them did this completely, with goodwill, and it wasn't necessarily their desire to create an exclusive world, it was that in many ways, nonetheless. And with social media, I think again, you had people creating online communities, platforms, communications tools that they thought were universal. When you think about Facebook and how it started, you had a network that was built around a 19-year-old Harvard sophomore's idea of what the most important aspects of communication were. That was always going to be really limited. And Facebook would have been, I think, a very different creation if Mark Zuckerberg had been someone who actually understood anything about the history of the web that had preceded him.
Had Zuckerberg been a chicken rather than an egg, things might have turned out okay, Scott.
I guess so. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know which side of that line you'd want to put him on.